For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sheila Barradas. Frans Cronje, CEO of the South African Institute of Race Relations, joins us to discuss his book, A Time Traveller's Guide to Our Next 10 Years. Your book, A Time Traveller's Guide to Our Next 10 Years, argues that South Africa is at a tipping point and that the country's future depends on how it chooses between the binaries of open democracy or authoritarianism, deregulation or state control, and educational strength or weakness. Why do you view these aspects as the country's key choices?
Well, a little bit of background on where the book comes from will be useful to you. We, more and more after 2007, the events at the Polity conference of the ANC that threw South African politics into turmoil, and then the global financial crisis, started getting questions from clients about where is South Africa headed. And the question was, you could distill it down to this: where is it going? Why is it going there? And when we get there, what's it going to be like? And we, of course, went back within the IRR and said, how do we answer this? And the book was one of the outcomes of that process, trying to give people a sense of direction. What does South Africa look like the morning after the 2024 election? And it became a product to clients, a briefing of sorts, and then we were asked to do a book on it. If you jump through years of work, the ultimate conclusion is that South Africa's future depends on how we answer two questions. Where do we go in terms of economic policy direction? Do we embrace, in a desperate bid to survive politically and economically, market-orientated economic reforms, the single-minded pursuit of growth? Or on the other side of that spectrum, do we embrace the view that the dirigist, state-directed economy can be more effective at meeting people's expectations? That's one axis of the scenarios. The second axis is, do we remain a free and open society as we are today? You can say whatever you want and you get away with it. Or are rights and freedoms eroded gradually to the point where a future government can act with impunity, do whatever it likes? And when you plot those two axes across each other, you produce a matrix. And the matrix offers up four quadrants, and the four quadrants are the four scenarios. And there we have direction. Where could South Africa go? Where we embrace market-driven growth and we remain a free and open society, implying a mandate for those reforms, a popular mandate, we become that rainbow nation in the end. By 2024, we're growing at 5%, and we're a stable political system with a democratic mandate for further reforms. The polar opposite scenario is the one that arises when we embrace the dirigist, state-driven economy in an environment where the government can act with impunity. It can do whatever it likes. And we describe that one as the rocky road, a socialism amidst crumbling democratic institutions. The third one was the intriguing one. In this case, we again go for market-driven growth. The fiscal wall that South Africa's run into at the moment, the high unemployment rates, we realise this isn't sustainable, both the country, business, unions and the like, and government. And we go for growth. But at the same time, we're becoming a less democratic society, which frees the government to do unpopular things in the long-term view that these are things that are to the ultimate benefit of South Africa's economy. For example, deregulation of labour markets would be one example. And we called that the narrow road future. And the model would be South Korea of the 1970s, for example. And after the book came out, I was sent on a tour to promote the book, and we spoke in a year to more than 200 audiences and everyone around the world, domestically, from youth activists to business leaders to all the political parties. And when speaking to government audiences, they were particularly drawn to that narrow road future, going for growth, the market-driven growth, in an environment where the state could act with impunity. The model, in a sense, is that of China, although similarities between us and the Chinese are too easy to overstate. The fourth scenario was the one that materializes if we don't go for growth. We never meet people's expectations, but we remain a free and open society, and what happens then? And the conclusions there were argued on the basis of very firmly established trends that the ANC is likely to lose the 2024 election, although no one's likely to win it. The ANC's majority goes below 50%. The Democratic Alliance and whatever the EFF have become are there, and they've got the balance. And between the three, we need a coalition government. And the question then is, what is the coalition? If it is a DA-ANC type of coalition, that could easily trigger us into one of the other upside scenarios, albeit on a delay of a decade. If it is an ANC-EFF alliance, that could easily trigger us into that downside scenario.
Is the South African government meeting the expectations of the country's citizens?
It's a very complex question, because if you read the mainstream media, you will read no. Service deliveries failed, you will be told, and jobless growth and all sorts of things. For the most part, those claims are nonsense. 6 million net new jobs were created after 1994. The number of people with a job moved from 8 to 14 million South Africans. Service delivery, we rate, and we're seen as a relatively conservative think tank, as one of South Africa's great successes after 1994. For every shack built after 94, for example, 10 formal houses were built in the country. The rollout of the social welfare system that became the broadest such system in any developing market, was the effect on the buying power of poor households was extraordinary. There can be no doubt at all that living standards of all South Africans, including the poorest South Africans, are very much higher than they were 20 years ago. And in that respect, the government has met many of the promises that it has made. And we accept, of course, that RDP houses fall down and there are too many potholes and the electricity is all far too often. All of that's true. But the scale of what was achieved in housing and water and electricity and job creation programs means we're a fundamentally different country to the one that we were. And our critics then say to us, if that's true, then why the angst and the protests and the uncertainty and the feeling of dread we have about where we're going? And we say there's no contradiction between the two. What South Africa is seeing is a crisis of rising expectations. We've done very well to raise the basic living standards of very poor people, but we've done that mainly through the redistribution of wealth, state-led development, state-led housing programs, for example. And what we've done is we've raised people's expectations, therefore, without putting them in a position, through access to the labour market, through the growth and the creation of new wealth, through education, of taking the next steps up the living standards ladder on their own. And that's a very dangerous position to get into. From a point of view of political stability alone, the African National Congress government would be in a better position had it never created these expectations at all, and we'd remained a largely poor society. And that's quite a statement to make. Its crisis is that it's driven those expectations upwards. But now, if we look at the state of the economy, we're on the verge of possibly a second 2 consecutive quarters of contraction, technical recession. Turmoil, protest actions, all from the poor to the middle classes on our university campuses. This is a crisis of rising expectations. So has the ANC met the expectations? Yes, they have, but what did they do wrong? They didn't calculate that this is a moving target. And the better you do, the greater the demands will become. And it cannot meet those demands. And that, not the failure of delivery or the failure of service delivery, lies at the heart of the uncertainty that we feel about South Africa today.
Do you think South African citizens have the means to change the way the country is governed?
Of course they do. They can vote in an election. The most powerful check and balance is available. And we do get into a mad situation where we talk about whether people have power and whether they have authority and whether they have access to enough institutions and whether the students who happen to be protesting about fees at universities across the country this morning, do they have the power and authority? They can change things in 5-year increments should they decide to do that. So the ability to change it is certainly there. South Africa is governed the way that it is, for better or worse, whichever side of that equation you stand on, because its people allow themselves to be governed like that. We're not a dictatorship. The ANC can't do whatever it likes. It might want to do that, but it can't. Whatever happens to us, it must never be said that this happened over the demands or despite the demands or expectations of South Africa's people. They have all the power, still all the responsibility, still in the state of the country is a reflection on the decisions South Africans took.
You have mentioned 4 metaphorical scenarios in your book: the wide road, the narrow road, the rocky road, and the toll road, each accompanied by different road signs along the way. Which road do you think South Africa is on currently?
Right, we get the question a lot. I answer it with a warning. We work in scenarios and not in forecasts, because forecasts don't work. The sort of grandfather of modern scenario planning is a Frenchman called Pierre Wack. And Wack worked for Shell, and in the 1970s he was able to convince the Shell leadership that the global oil price could take off when it had been flat for decades. He didn't say this would happen, he says it could happen if certain circumstances combine. He proved to be right after 1973 and allowed Shell to take somewhat of a lead in the global oil industry. And from that point onwards, scenario planning becomes a feature of, it's taught in a lot of business schools and corporate planning and the like. And Wack later writes 2 influential articles in the Harvard Business Review. And what he says is important. He says the danger in forecasting, which implies suggesting a single future at a specific point in time and space, is that forecasts are often correct. But the forecast is only correct because the world that it is based on has not yet changed. When that world changes fundamentally, the forecast is useless. And if you are a corporate that relied on that forecast, what do? You've got to go back and forecast again. The recent examples include the North African uprisings. That couldn't have been forecast 5 or 6 years ago. The global financial crisis, the rise of ISIS. Forecasts would have been difficult. Scenarios are different. They are not forecasts at all. They are a different methodology entirely. Instead of trying to take a user to a single point in future space and time, what a scenario is trying to do is tell the user what could plausibly happen if the following key decisions are made. The point is to give a complete spectrum of what is plausible, the possible future. Explain to the user what steps will trigger each future and then leave them alone. And the power of the methodology is not to be tempted to think that there's a forecast, not to use short-term trends to make decisions about long-term outcomes. It's, again, a paradigm shift in how to think about the future. It's the potential future as opposed to the official future that works in a forecast. Our warning to clients, therefore, is don't be tempted to use South Africa's short-term trends to come to long-term outcomes. The example we quote to them, and then I'll answer your question, is take the morning of the 16th of August 1985, the night before P.V. Botha's addressed the National Party Congress in what became known as the Rubicon speech. And Botha says to them, I will not, it's a quote, I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide. Chase Manhattan, the American banking group, won't roll over our loans. We're bankrupt as a country. White conscripts are fighting township youth and driving around in hippos. There are wars in the frontline states. Mandela's in prison, the Cold War's on the go. If you that morning produced a forecast that within just more than 10 years, the last leader of the National Party will become the tourism minister in an ANC cabinet, which despite its Eastern European influences will halve the interest rates it inherited from the Nats, people would have said, it's impossible and it cannot be done. That's the danger of relying on a forecast. Don't do it. There's an uncanny extent to which the outlier scenario materializes. So having warned you, on current trends, I think we're headed for a hybrid of between the rocky road socialist future and the ANC's electoral defeat. The breaking point there is, can the ANC destroy democratic institutions? But that's where its economic policies are necessarily leading us. That's not to say that's where we'll end. In fact, quite the opposite is possible, in that as the abyss comes into focus, it frightens the hell out of people, politicians included, and they do the U-turn and we end up in one of the upside scenarios. So as much as it seems implausible now, the upside scenarios in our independent and conservative assessment remain a plausible outcome for South Africa in 2024.
What interventions do you think are most urgent for South Africa?
Well, we think there are a number of things that need to be done. And when such questions are asked, people respond with vagaries and theories and highfalutin academic ideas. it needs to be far more practical. The deregulation of the labour market is essential to price poor people into jobs. We're not talking about fractional youth unemployment rates. Half of young people don't have a job because they're not competitive enough to get into our labour markets. You've got to regulate them into that labour market. The concept of a right to work clause in the Constitution is an example. That's number one. Number two, the quality of basic education is appallingly bad. There are governments that can run good school systems. This is not going to be one of them. We've seen enough to be certain of that outcome. There are schools that work well, though. There are schools in which the parents take the decisions about what happens to their children. The communities own the schools or take pride in them, and the headmaster's a strict character, and there's no sight anywhere of the South African Democratic Teachers Union. You can give that option to more kids via systems of contract or voucher schooling. How that works simply is you take the education budget, you divide it by the number of kids, you give the parents vouchers they can only spend on education, and the market you've created, and the fact that parents take better decisions about their children than politicians do, which is surely be absolutely true, means that we can, in the short term, deliver a far higher quality of school leaver. That's number two. Number three, the environment. Capital will go where it's welcome. And the South African environment is hostile to capital, both domestic and foreign. Look how many leading South African businesses and entrepreneurs now find themselves outside. I could cite reams of examples of clients we've dealt with who've taken decisions to place investments outside South Africa because of the difficult domestic regulatory environment. And that runs from migration to labour to corruption and to empowerment policy. Go back to the sources of capital, hat in hand, and say, what do you need to invest in a future South Africa? Listen to them and create that environment, and you have the third piece of the puzzle. Access to the labour market, far higher levels of investment-driven growth, and a somewhat better school system gets us out of these woods here. Unfortunately, we're sitting in a position now where this year, just to cite one example, a cabinet minister has said we need to destroy monopoly capital. It's why I say it's very difficult to sustain the arguments for the upside scenario. Fortunately, the consequences of such backward thinking are being felt in the cabinet and by the government, mainly in that they're running out of money to run the country with. That was the final piece of the puzzle that forced the nationalists to reform in the 80s. If it has that same effect on the ANC, then again those upside scenarios can be realised. But those are the three steps. Watch those three areas. If they line up with each other and those decisions are taken, South Africa's got a very good chance. If those decisions are not taken, South Africa doesn't have a chance.
That was Frans Cronje, CEO of the Institute of Race Relations, discussing his book, A Time Traveller's Guide to Our Next 10 Years.